Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling in from. Thank you for joining our, I think, final or maybe near final Globinar, certainly our last educational Globinar. My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Chamber, and I'm joining you today from Menlo Park, California. And we've got people in warmer climates and in colder climates speaking with us today. And so I'm kind of right in the middle of things. And why not? It's an appropriate time of year to reflect on the end of the year and the changing weather, including the alignment of stars that we had last night, actually the alignment of planets. And today in our conversation, we have the alignment of experts discussing, how you can reshore your business from other parts of the world into North America. And one of the options that, I find most Asian companies, most European companies, even North American companies are not familiar with, we're going to be talking about today. There's actually at least two main options and then other options that we're going to be covering. And so we're going to jump right into the first option, and then we're going to expand the conversation into other options and speak about it more broadly. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end, and so hang on to your seats. I think you're going to learn a lot today. You're going to be connected to some really smart people who can help you with your business, and you'll have time for Q&A as well. So let me first introduce our first introducer and speaker is Ricardo Rascon. He's the marketing manager with Tetakawi. They're actually the largest employer in the state of Sonora, Mexico, and that's because they have a particular option that I find most people don't fully grasp or understand, and we're going to dig deep today so that you get it. Ricardo, please go ahead and give your introduction, and then introduce David McQueen as well, please.
All right, thanks a lot, Doug. I appreciate the invitation and the great introduction. I'm based here in Tucson, Arizona, about 65 miles away from the Arizona-Sonora border. And today I'd like to introduce my colleague, David McQueen. David McQueen is based in just outside of Toronto, Canada. He's a management consultant for Tetakawi. He's been with us for about 8 years now. And overall, he has about 40 years of manufacturing experience. What always makes David so unique is, he's planned and launched 2 Mexican operations on his own. As the president of 2 Canadian companies, he's gone through the due diligence process and, in terms of identifying a site, finding the right location, the right mode of entry. He's been there, done that, and got the T-shirt. And since those 2 successful operations, he's helped, many other companies, make the right decision about whether or not they should expand into Mexico. So without much further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dave, and Dave's going to talk a little bit about Tetakawi, different modes of entry to manufacturing in Mexico, and some considerations that companies should make before, taking the jump.
Thank you, Ricardo. Appreciate the introduction. First of all, let me start by telling you a bit about Tetakawi. First of all, we are a shelter service company, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later in my presentation. We're a US-based company. We're headquartered in Tucson, Arizona, but most of our operations are in Mexico, and we are the largest shelter service company operating in Mexico today. We currently employ a little over 24,000 people in Mexico and the United States. Most of those people are in fact working under the direction of our clients in Mexico. We also own and manage a little over 5 million square feet of industrial space, and we support some clients in third-party real estate as well. And as we speak, we're currently supporting the ongoing operations of 75 different foreign corporations in Mexico. Now, down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the logos of a couple of our sister companies that also help us with our operations. ILS is a logistics and freight forwarding company. Denisa is our real estate and property development arm. And Intugo offers similar types of solutions to Tetakawi, but for companies operating in office-based environments. So Tetakawi focuses on factories and manufacturing, which is our topic today, but Intugo provides similar kinds of solutions for people like engineering design offices, software development offices, call centers, anyone operating in an office environment. So what I want to start out with is talking about the advantages of Mexico versus China as a reshoring operation or option. I'm not necessarily excluding other low-cost countries, but since China is the dominant country of choice right now for offshore manufacturing, I think it makes sense to start with a comparison to China, and many of these points also apply to comparisons with other low-cost options. So first of all, Mexico offers minimal legal or political risk. The structure in Mexico of the government and their relationship with business is very similar to the United States and most Western countries. There's very little direct interference in the operations of companies, and there's certainly no political appointees on the boards or in the operations of companies. Secondly, Mexico has more free trade agreements than any other country in the world. So the access to free trade through Mexico, as Mexico is a base for free trade, is unprecedented compared to other countries. And in particular, of course, if your operations are focused on delivering goods to the United States or to Canada, then the free trade agreement, the USMCA, is a critical piece of that activity. That's the agreement that replaced NAFTA, and it includes Mexico, United States, and Canada. Logistics are obviously improved if you're going to service the American market, but also, of course, South America and Canada and the Caribbean are also closer. So not only is it less expensive to deliver goods, but Mexico offers a much shorter turnaround, which means smaller inventories and much more rapid market response. And a point that is sometimes overlooked is communications are simplified. Now, companies have gotten pretty good at dealing with that 12-hour time difference between Asia and North America. But the bottom line is it creates inefficiencies. It results in less communication, less frequent communication, and more complex communications. Mexico is obviously in exactly the same time zones as the United States, so communication is much easier, quicker, and it happens more efficiently and more frequently. And then, of course, the big one, costs. Now, in most cases, Mexico is going to offer lower manufacturing costs than China, but not all. One of the cautions is that in some cases, there are factors, and we'll talk about a few of them, that can mean that it's actually less costly to produce your goods in China, or that Mexico offers minimal cost advantage. Let's dig into those costs a little bit more. So I've provided a few benchmarks here. There are many others we could look at where Mexico also has advantages, but these are some of the most important ones. So first of all, the first line is fully fringed unskilled wages. This is direct labor wages, and we've compared comparable fringe benefits, comparable experience levels, and comparable skill levels in Mexico and in China, and the gap is typically around 35%, so significant savings. The same thing happens, but to a slightly lesser degree, with engineering salaries. So once again, fully fringed, comparable level of experience and skill, degreed engineers. The gap with China is about 24%. So it can save substantially in Mexico on engineering salaries, and that carries over to other professional salaries. Electrical power is comparable, but Mexico still has a slight advantage in the cost of electrical power. And then, of course, a big advantage on shipping. Now, we benchmarked a shipment from Monterrey to Chicago as an example. And in that case, it is less than half the cost from Mexico that it is from China. That's not a surprise, but it's important to remember that kind of advantage for the same volume container. And then even more importantly, I think, is the days of transit. So about a 34-day savings. From Mexico versus China, that translates into a very significant difference in market response. And of course, from Mexico, if you need to expedite, you can put it on a straight through truck, and then a few hours later, it can be in the United States. That's a big difference from what you can do in China. There are some disadvantages or some areas where you might need to have some concerns, and I want to mention a few of those. So one is that niche skills and expertise may not be as readily available as they are in China. China dismantled a huge state-run, closed economy, vertically integrated in a very large country. And consequently, there's almost no skill or ability to manufacture that is totally lacking. It may not be at the same level as it is in the United States or other countries, but it's available. In Mexico, the country's smaller and the evolution was different. It was driven primarily by foreign investment, and the initial players were OEMs with heavy degrees of vertical integration within their own organization. So some skills and expertise are not as readily available as you might like. And it's important if you do require certain niche skills and expertise to make sure whether they are or are not available. Now, most companies won't find a problem here. Mexico has a great number of very skilled people, but I raise this caution because we have seen some companies that do have gaps that can't be filled in Mexico. Same thing happens with processes that, once again, it's rare, but there are certain specialized processes, for example, some kinds of specialized sterilization for medical devices, some kinds of specialized plating or surface treatments, some kinds of specialized heat treatment that are not readily available or not available at all in Mexico. And if your process involves intermediate steps of shuttling goods back and forth through one of these processes, it might be difficult to do in many areas in Mexico, or perhaps not economical at all. Again, very few companies are going to encounter this, but it is important to think about it and to realize that it's not quite the same as China, where things are readily available in almost every area. Another thing to caution you about is senior staffing costs. Now, I mentioned the gaps in professional level and direct labor, but when you get into senior management and higher professional levels, professional managers and so on, the gap closes significantly with Mexico and the United States. And that's, of course, because these professionals are mobile, they're a global commodity, so their compensation package is very similar to what it would be in the United States. Consequently, if your organization is very heavy in that area and very light on the direct labor end of the scale, you may find relatively little or no savings in that part of your business versus China. And lastly, there are some supply chain limitations. And essentially, this is, again, back to the structure of and the evolution of the Mexican manufacturing environment versus the Chinese manufacturing environment. And I'm going to show you a slide here which highlights that. So along the one side, you can see a bunch of different processes and commodities that are typically supplied into to larger assemblies. And then you'll see a blue line and a dark gray line. The blue line represents the available capacity to manufacture that item in Mexico currently, and the black line represents the consumption of that particular commodity or good in Mexico currently. So what you can see is that in many cases, there's a shortage of supply. Mexico consumes more of that item than is manufactured within their boundaries right now, and consequently, there's an unfilled market. Now, this is good news if you happen to produce one of the things on the left-hand side, because it means you're going to move into a situation in which there's a ready local market for your production. It's maybe not so good news if you are a consumer of these goods. You need to make sure that you can find an adequate supply at an acceptable price, and ensure that that's not going to increase your costs. And in many cases, it won't. But in some cases, this may be an impediment. So you need to be careful about it. So let's say you've looked through all this. Now you wonder, can you benefit by manufacturing in Mexico? Well, essentially, yes, if raw materials are available and in the specifications that you require, and they generally are going to be, but in some cases they won't be. Same with sub-tier suppliers. Are they available? Are they capable of the technologies that you require? In many cases, you're going to find they are, but in some niche situations, they may not be. If labor cost is important to you, Mexico is obviously going to be very attractive. That gap on labor of 34%, 35% is significant. The same is true of transportation costs, or transportation time is important. There's a very significant gap, particularly to the American market, when you compare China versus Mexico because of Mexico's proximity. And then for everybody, whether any of the previous points apply or not, if tariff exposure is a concern, Mexico has to be on your list. Mexico's inside the USMCA. It's protected from many types of tariff action, and there's no particular agenda to apply tariffs. At least there's no agenda expected under the incoming administration in the United States. But in the case of China, it's not just the possibility or likelihood that the incoming administration will continue to view China negatively from a trade perspective. There's also pushback from most Western European countries and from countries like Canada and Australia. So China is likely to be subject to tariff action on a continuing basis for the foreseeable future. And if that's likely to expose your business, you should be thinking of an alternative. Now, Mexico may not be the low-cost country of choice if raw material costs are not critical to you. If they are a global commodity and are available everywhere, or they are not available in Mexico and available somewhere else, then perhaps that's a driver for you. The same with niche processes, that could be a barrier. We've talked that through already. Another point is that labor or shipping costs are low, then there may not be much advantage to being in Mexico. So for example, if you produce a very small electronic component on a highly automated process, and it can be shipped economically even by air because of the small volume, then there might be no real advantage to relocating your manufacturing unless you're subject to tariff exposure. So you've decided Mexico is an alternative. Now, how do you get there? Now, the first alternative is subcontracting, but I'm going to leave that because Eduardo is going to talk about that in his part of the presentation. You can form a joint venture, or you can acquire a company in Mexico. Mexico allows foreigners to do this without very many restrictions at all. There are a few industries that are restricted to foreign acquisition or foreign investment, but manufacturing is not one of them. So you can set joint ventures up in any percentage you like with anyone you like. You can acquire companies in Mexico, or you can incorporate companies in Mexico. And each of these options have different advantages and disadvantages. The one that you may not be familiar with is the shelter. And that's a unique option in Mexico, which gives you most of the benefits of incorporation without creating a permanent establishment in Mexico. So let's talk about the difference in a little bit more detail. First of all, as I just mentioned, a corporation has permanent establishment, of course. A shelter does not. Now, the shelter provider that you work with will have permanent establishment in Mexico, but what you are permitted to do is to use that shelter as your legal umbrella. The Mexican government holds the shelter provider accountable in the same way that they would have held you accountable if you had permanent establishment, but they do not restrict your operation or hold you accountable. Both types of organizations pay corporate tax, and very similar mechanisms in place for both of them. So there's no difference there. The shelter, by virtue of not having permanent establishment, is not the employer of record. The shelter provider is. You're not the importer of record. You don't have direct liability. And all of those things do apply to a corporation. Now, a shelter cannot own property. You don't have a legal presence in Mexico, so you can't own property in Mexico. You can own it in your corporate organization in a foreign country and consign it to Mexico, and of course that's what people do, but you can't actually own property. So where does this come into play? Primarily real estate, where you want to own that property in Mexico, perhaps. In that case, a corporation can do that, a shelter can't, but a shelter operation is allowed to form a corporation for the purpose of owning real estate and to have a shelter that then uses that facility, so you can get around it that way. In both cases, you control your operation. The shelter provider works under your direction. They obviously need to perform certain tasks for you because you don't have a legal presence, but those tasks are performed under your control and direction, and the shelter must perform them to your instructions in the same ways if you outsourced any other service. Lastly, both of them are EMEX organizations. Now, EMEX is the program that allows foreign companies to export from Mexico or between exporting companies in Mexico without paying value-added tax, or recovering value-added tax if they have paid it. So a very important program. Much of the business in Mexico and much of the manufacturing is done by EMEX corporations, and they can be corporations or shelters. The shelter cannot be a non-EMEX corporation. So if you need to do non-EMEX activities, in other words, if you need to sell to an end user in Mexico and you need to charge value-added tax in order to do that, then you need a non-EMEX corporation. And in the case of corporations, this also implies two corporations. You need an EMEX and a non-EMEX corporation. In the case of the shelter is EMEX, but a shelter cannot be non-EMEX. So similar to my example for real estate, you can have a shelter operation that doesn't have permanent establishment, and you can form a non-EMEX corporation that does have permanent establishment for the purpose only of doing non-EMEX tax. And many companies do exactly that. The legal structure, corporations are incorporated like they are in the United States, and shelters are contracted with a legal contract. That's the basis that the Mexican government recognizes. You have a contract with a shelter provider. So let's talk a little bit more about incorporation. First of all, as I said, 100% foreign ownership is permitted. Multiple companies are permitted. Similar in the options available to incorporation in the United States. And there are certain activities that need certain types of companies. Now, we touched on that a minute ago. One example I gave you was real estate, where you might have a separate company, an EMEX, non-EMEX, where incorporated or shelter, you still need two entities to do that. But the incorporation process in Mexico is relatively inexpensive and simple. So multiple corporations are as easy to form as they are in the United States. So steps in Mexico, you need a permit to incorporate. You need to specify your activities. That's to make sure you're incorporating the right types and number of companies. The incorporation proceedings take you about 3 weeks. Then you need to apply to the Secretary of the Economy to become a maquiladora. That's an EMEX entity. That usually takes a couple weeks. You need to complete some other registrations, municipal, state, social services, things like that. That typically takes another 4 or 5 weeks. Then you're in a position to apply for an EMEX certification. Now, you can conduct business as an EMEX corporation before being certified. You will be able to recover your value-added tax, but you will have to pay it in advance. And the EMEX certification process takes about 6 months to a year, and it allows you to actually not pay value-added tax in many circumstances, rather than having to forward the money and then recover it. It's time-based, it takes time. Shelters are already certified, so that's one of the advantages of the shelter. It avoids this certification process and the cash flow implications. Typically, $5,000 to $10,000 US per company will get you a highly qualified Mexican lawyer and accountant to form a company for you. Obviously, it can be a lot more depending on what you want to do. So how does the shelter work? Well, as I mentioned, the basis of the shelter is a contract. So you have a foreign corporation, and by the way, it must be a foreign corporation, can't be a Mexican company. And they find a shelter partner. In our case, as I mentioned, we're a US company, so I've shown a US entity, but it could be a Mexican shelter provider as well. And a contract is negotiated between those two parties. That contract does a couple of things. It says that the shelter company will provide the legal umbrella that the Mexican government will recognize, so that the foreign corporation will not have permanent establishment in Mexico. It stipulates a range of services that the shelter company will provide. Some of them are mandatory because the foreign company will not have a permanent establishment, but most shelter companies also offer a range of related support services, which may or may not be chosen by the foreign corporation to be outsourced. And I'll talk more about that in a minute or two. The shelter company can then set up a Mexican entity, or they actually are typically already going to have one that qualifies as a shelter provider. That's who the Mexican government's going to look to for legal and regulatory compliance. And once all that's in place, then the foreign corporation sets up a manufacturing unit in the in Mexico, which is where they will operate their manufacturing. And it looks just like a subsidiary anywhere in the world. It has their processes, their signage, the policies. If you set that up, it's your company. And that company will then in turn direct the shelter provider to do certain services. Obviously the ones that are mandatory because the Mexican unit doesn't have legal establishment, but any other services they've contracted for. So for example, the Mexican unit wants to hire an employee. They will direct the shelter company to hire the employee, register them with the social services, make sure they get a payroll and employment deductions and all of the legal requirements necessary to hire an employee. The Mexican manufacturing may or may not look to the shelter company for things like recruiting services. That's optional, but they may provide those as well. So what else does a shelter do? Well, they usually provide an extensive range of administrative services. Some of them, as I mentioned, are based on the core services that they have to perform, but in many cases, they've expanded these. So for example, most shelters can be your entire human resource department, doing everything from recruiting through conflict resolution, union negotiations, payroll, benefits, everything. The same is true of import-export in Mexico. Most shelters can be your entire import-export department, make sure your EMEX compliance is in order, preparing all of the documents necessary, filing the documents, arranging all of the importation and exportation activity. They can also be your local purchasing entity, and in fact, they kind of have to be. if you want to purchase goods in Mexico, because you don't have the ability to execute a legal contract in Mexico. So they would do that. But usually they will offer expanded purchasing services, accounts payable to support those services, and then they'll ensure legal compliance of all the activities they're doing for you, and they take responsibility for that. Under the regulatory sphere, their role is more advisory. So they're going to make sure that health and safety rules are communicated to your operation in Mexico, which is under your direction. The same with environmental, taxes, fees, any other compliance issues that are regulatory. But of course, it's your facility, so you must make sure your employees in that facility follow the directions of the shelter provider and of the government. If there are issues, though, they go back to the shelter provider. And lastly, many shelter companies provide facilities. So in our case, for example, we have complete industrial parks where there are buildings available and a bunch of support services. We provide building maintenance, and some other shelters do as well. And then we provide shared services. So for example, common busing amongst all of the clients in our industrial park, which lowers transportation costs to get employees to work. Medical services on site with an ambulance and doctors and nurses, and security services for all of our clients, which secure the perimeter, control access, that kind of thing. And there are other services that individual shelters do or do not provide, but there can be a whole range of outsourced administrative and facility services that you simply don't need to perform in Mexico. The advantages are a number of things. First of all, there's no learning curve. The shelter already knows what to do. Secondly, you have expert assistance from experienced professionals who are already in place, along with an infrastructure to support them. Thirdly, you gain the economic benefit of outsourcing your Mexican administration, as well as not needing to provide facilities for administrators or needing to manage them. So during the phase in which you are operating with a shelter, and by the way, a shelter is something you can be in for a short period of time and transition out of, or you can operate in it forever. It's your choice. But during the time that you're operating there, all of the Mexican administration is somebody else's problem. There's no Mexican legal or regulatory exposure. We've mentioned that a number of times, and that lowers risk significantly, especially when you're new to the country. And another key point is that there's significantly lower investment in operating costs. Now, some of our clients are Fortune 500 companies, in some of them even with other large operations in Mexico. One of the reasons they deal with us in some cases is because the operation that is under our assistance or support is smaller. And because it's smaller, the economics of providing the complete infrastructure are higher, but they can take advantage of the fact that the shelter provider can spread those economies of scale over the entire client base to lower their costs. So typically, facilities of less than 300 to 500 people are going to find a bottom line cost savings advantage by operating with a shelter because of the critical mass of the shelter. Beyond that, it may not be a cost penalty, but probably the advantage will be less significant because you have the critical mass yourself to support some of these services economically. And that brings us to the last point of critical mass. The shelter is a way of starting small and growing, and therefore, even for large operations, an operation that may ultimately be several thousand people, it can be a much easier way to get launched when you start with one person and start to grow. So for some period of time, the shelter can provide you with the advantages. If you're going to forever be smaller in your Mexican operation, then there's probably an ongoing benefit, both in terms of the quality of administration you're going to receive and the cost of providing that information by partnering with a shelter. I want to share with you some of the best practices of our client base in terms of standalone manufacturing in Mexico. And this includes people who have continued to remain with the shelter, as well as those that have only used our service just for a startup. First of all, their number one recommendation is start with a shelter. And that's not just because they've done it. In some cases, we have clients who didn't do it and came to some kind of disaster and then started again with a shelter. And why would you do that? Well, it just simply lowers the risk and lowers the cost. When you're launching, you can always migrate out of the shelter whenever you're ready and whenever your boots are on the ground and you feel confident you can handle that. You want to choose an experienced partner. That's whether you use a shelter or not. I think one of the biggest mistakes some companies make is assuming that they understand Mexico. They may even have, someone, the secretary's cousin's uncle's best friend who once started a plant in Mexico. These people are probably great members of your team, but launching businesses, particularly in a foreign country, is and can be complicated. You want to choose a partner that's been through it many times, has seen all kinds of different things happen, and has solutions for all of those issues. And that applies whether you choose to work with a shelter provider or whether you choose to launch on your own. Make sure you have a range of very experienced partners. Maintain some tight financial controls. This might seem obvious, but many of our clients mention it as something that they felt they didn't do as well as they should have when they first launched. And there's a couple reasons for it. One's obvious, to protect themselves against fraud or errors. But there's another side to it, and I saw this myself, and that is by maintaining very tight financial controls, you see all the transactions that are going on, and you have the ability to intervene in the operation and help guide people towards where they should and should not spend money. And in my case, what happened was I realized that we weren't spending money on maintenance parts. And when I dug into that, I found out that my staff felt they were doing the right thing by avoiding maintenance expenditures, when in fact, in my view, they were doing the wrong thing by allowing the equipment to deteriorate. So I was able to direct them that, no, I'm not going to be angry if you spend this money. I want you to spend it. And that changed the behavior. So many clients, I think, find that there's two benefits to that tight financial controls in the early phases of the operation, for sure. Another one that seems obvious is communicate clearly. But again, our clients frequently mention this, and it also has two sides to it. One is it's very easy to forget that most of the people in the organization will speak Spanish and won't speak English to any great degree. Certainly the professionals and the managers are going to speak English probably very well. But when you get to the supervisory level and below that, then they're probably only going to speak Spanish. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the Mexican culture is one of a great deal of politeness and courtesy, a desire to avoid conflict and disappointment. And that results in a response to requests or demands that may seem like a yes, but in fact, it's really a maybe. And if you contrast that to, say, American business culture, in which there's a great deal of direct speech and very clear statements and no real reluctance to raise barriers or to oppose, then sometimes the message gets lost. And so many of our clients have mentioned that it's important to remind yourself that what you think is a yes may not be a yes. On the Mexican side, what you think is a suggestion might actually be an instruction. So there's both of those involved. Another point I would make is provide for comfortable travel. Many of our clients have found that in the early stage, when there's a lot of back and forth, they haven't provided for comfortable travel, and they haven't provided for economical travel. And so employees start to chafe, costs start to rise, and there's a lot of really good solutions available. Mexico offers a very wide range of serviced accommodations and furnished apartments and driving services and all kinds of things to help support people who are temporarily or for an extended period of time going to be working in Mexico. And the better you do that, the happier everyone is, and the smoother the transition goes. And the most important point, I think, is train aggressively. It's easy to forget that a new operation start anywhere in the world starts with no native knowledge. And no matter how well documented your company is and how careful they are about training and documentation, if there's no native knowledge, there's going to be gaps. So finding those gaps, providing the training, particularly in the first 5 years of operation. After that point in time, there is native knowledge and things start to roll along as they do in most other locations. But for that first period, it's better to assume that people don't know, provide them with more materials than they need, more ways of training, and to make sure a lot of that training is in Spanish if you want to be successful. So next steps we'd recommend, decide what gateway works for you. You're going to hear about subcontracting next, and that's one of the choices, but I've also mentioned that there are 4 other choices, including the shelter. Talk to some experienced advisors. There's lots of people available. Make sure they've done this multiple times, and that'll work well. Put a support team together that includes your Mexican advisors, and if that's done early, more problems will be avoided, and the transition will go more smoothly. Put your manufacturing plan together, however you're going to do it, with your support team that includes your advisors, and then of course estimate costs. And I want to mention, I put estimate costs on here not because I thought people would forget about that. I'm sure they won't, but it's difficult to get accurate data in Mexico. It's challenging. So a lot of data can be either old and therefore not relevant, or very difficult to obtain. Now, there are people that can provide you with help there. Certainly shelter organizations are one of them. They get to see a lot of operations and have access to a lot of data. But there are others. There are consultants. There are other people that can provide you with help estimating costs. I encourage you to get that help. There's a lot of misinformation out there on what your costs are going to be, and that can be a very challenging thing if you make a mistake there. But there are people that can help. So that's the end of my section. I'm going to shift this now to Eduardo and let him take over, and he's going to talk about subcontracting.
Thank you, David. I just wanted to say, as we make the transition, I love what you just laid out. I mean, it was great information. It was transparent. It showed positives and negatives, and I'm very, very excited by what you just shared. And it's further confirmation that the tribe within Global Chamber not only know what they're talking about, but they're not there to sugarcoat anything. They're there just to give you the straight facts. And it's so essential in global business that you deal with people who are giving you the straight facts. And so another one of those people is Eduardo. So he has over 25 years experience with what was Pro Mexico, and through that experience he knows everybody in Mexico, he knows everybody in the United States, he knows everybody in North America, and he's not just knowledgeable, but he's also transparent in his dealings with our members. And so, Eduardo, we really appreciate your support and collaboration, and we look forward to hearing from you about this other option.
Thank you so much, Doug. I really appreciate it. And thank you, David, also for the really informative presentation that you did. Let me share my screen here. Can you see my screen?
We can, yes.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So, my name is Eduardo Gonzalez. I am the president and founder of 250A Consulting. I have about 20 years experience helping foreign companies locate manufacturing plants in Mexico, or helping them source their products or their manufacturing from Mexico. So I'm very glad to be here. I'm very grateful for Doug and Tetakawi for having me in this event. And today, well, we're going to talk about the how the reshoring manufacturing and the USMCA plays in manufacturing in Mexico and in general in North America, in particular, how to locate contract manufacturing in Mexico. So Dave already spoke about the benefits. So Mexico is part of the USMCA. We are a very cost competitive country with a very effective workforce. I think if you have a manufacturing procedure, a manufacturing plan, way of doing things, you're going to find that Mexico is going to be very productive. We have seen it in the past with other foreign companies. Their operations in Mexico usually are the most productive and win all of the awards. If you're looking for talent, also Mexico offers a lot of engineers. There's a lot of universities giving different degrees from different types of engineering. We are a great platform to export to other countries. We have free trade agreements with more than 50 countries. There are a total of 13 free trade agreements. And of course, you cannot beat the location of Mexico on the border with the US for manufacturing and logistics. So that makes supply chains that are more safer and more effective, more practical. Since we are part of the USMCA, your intellectual property is protected, so you feel more comfortable having your intellectual property being shared with a contract manufacturer in Mexico than in other countries. And of course, being so near to the US, we significantly reduce the lead times for shipments, as they mentioned also in his presentation, along with logistics costs. And of course, although with some limitations, depending on the processes you're looking for, the type of suppliers, we do have a large supplier base, mainly automotive, injection molding, any metal manufacturing, sheet metal machining. I think you will not have a problem locating a supplier in Mexico. Now, like many places around the world, Mexico has its own unique way of doing business, its own culture, its own language. Its history makes it a very particular place to do business. So our job is to help companies navigate during the process of funding either a location or a contract manufacturer. We hold their hand and we try to do that cultural translation and try always to save companies time and money. So basically what we do, we simplify the process for companies looking for either sources of product or sources of contract manufacturing. So we have seen how the supply chain has changed dramatically in the past year with tariffs and COVID and logistics costs. For example, one of the companies we talked last week, they mentioned that they usually pay around $3,500 for a full container, and that cost has jumped to $7,500 plus the 25% tariffs. So that's a considerable increase in their cost. And of course, they were looking for other sourcing of manufacturing. And I think Mexico is a great option for them. So if your company is not sure if manufacturing in Mexico will save them money, we can also help them find out how much the tariffs will be if you manufacture in Mexico. So we help develop a customs analysis for them, where we get the bill of materials, the origins of those products, the final assembly, and we let them know how much the tariff will be. Some cases, there's the possibility that the tariff will be the same if you bring in raw material from China and then export it to Mexico, so there's not much savings. But if there's a jump of the tariff, let's say you're importing materials and exporting a different product, then you will see a lot of benefits. But the only way to find out is actually to do this customs analysis. So that's something we recommend and something that we offer. Of course, with the IMEX program in Mexico, you're able to bring in raw material without any duties, have that raw material transform or assemble or turn into a different product and export into the US. But in some cases, it could be that you still could be hit with some tariffs. Now, as you know, there are many options to manufacture in Mexico. So we learned just about the shelter option, and it brings to mind a couple of Arizona companies that are under the shelter program with Tetakawi, St. Clair Technologies and Walbar. The first one makes harnesses for automotive and aerospace, and Walbar makes the blades for the airplane engines. So that's a couple of examples where a shelter has offered them a great solution for their manufacturing. But in those cases, when you're looking for contract manufacturing, well, we can help you source what you need. And of course, we can help also locate a standalone operation, or we can help on the site selection. educate people about the IMEX program. Like I said, IMEX is a federal program where you're able to import raw materials from outside Mexico without any duties and have those raw materials transform into a final product. And that's a huge advantage. And that's a program that started in the 70s in Mexico, and we have seen it grow year by year. Now, I would also like to point out Mexico will not be a solution for everyone. Some Chinese companies are heavily subsidized, and they can provide much better prices for assembly products than any company anywhere in the world. So no one can compete with some raw material cost in China. Nobody can compete with subsidies. So Mexico is a great option if you're looking for a competitive company that works with the international costs. But no one, like I said, can compete with any type of subsidies in Mexico. So if some companies have a great contract, great volumes with a Chinese company, and they want to move their manufacturing in Mexico, and we have found that it's pretty difficult to get the same prices that they get in China. So it's not for everyone, but the only way to find out is to actually go out and get the quotes and do the work, and then find out, well, where will be your best option to manufacture, and we can help with that. So if you're looking for a nearshore your manufacturing, we can help. Usually what we need is a profile of the company you're looking for. For example, the type of equipment or processes that you will need. With that, we can go out and look for companies in the 5 main manufacturing regions in Mexico. So we have the Northwest, which is basically the California, Baja California region, the North, which basically Texas, Chihuahua, the Northeast, Monterrey, a lot of heavy industries there. And of course, the center of Mexico, well, we can find the automotive industry pretty well situated and with very long experience and very expanded supply base. The Southwest, mainly Jalisco, you have a lot of IT companies and a lot of manufacturing companies. So each region offers their own advantages, their own logistics specification, and especially different supply base. So we can help locate companies in those 5 regions, or look for options in those regions. So what we offer companies is the possibility to listen to them. So every project is different. So we take time to listen and understand the supply chain needed for the type of process the project will require. For example, if they will need some chemical treatment for the product, or surface finishing, or some other type of suppliers. Once we have all the information, we go out and try to give options for them. We always give an honest opinion from the start. So we don't want to take anyone's time or money. We really want to see them succeed with their strategies in Mexico. So we propose a plan of action with very comprehensive deliverables and with a very cost-efficient proposal in order for them to save money and find the right location. So this is my presentation. I will leave the rest time for question. Here's my contact information in case someone is wondering also about the logo and the name. The 258 comes from the 258 border monuments that were put in place in the 1800s between Mexico and the US. So I like the idea of having this type of markers instead of fences and walls on the border, especially considering how the 2 economies are tied in from the start. So thank you so much, Doug. Appreciate it, and hope I can answer the questions that the companies will have.
Thank you very much. And I think, having lived around the world in the last 15 years in Arizona and on the border, I've gotten a much greater appreciation for what you talked about in terms of the value. I guess I can think of it as the mega region of Mexico and US and alignment, rather than many who are further away don't really fully gather the value that's there, and that's part of the purpose today. I also want to cite you in a positive way relative to a large Japanese company that came in the last few weeks, and they had some very particular interests, and you have, I'd say, I would describe it as bend over backwards for them, and there's some particular needs that they have, and including some market studies that they are interested in, that you're able to help them with. So thank you very much for all that you do, and that's a further explanation that you and Tetakawi both are dedicated to doing the right thing and sharing very transparently what's really out there. Thank you. And so I want to. We do have we have about 9 minutes, so we don't have a lot of time for questions, but there are some questions in the chat. If you have some and we don't get time for them, send them in the chat. We'll gather it and we'll collect it and we'll answer them later. Or if you want to either connect up with the people who are speaking today, or you have further questions, info@globalchamber.org will get you connected. Let's start with a question from the great and powerful Mike Patterson of Spencer Fane, and it leads a little bit to kind of what USMCA is creating, and also some of the what Mike calls resentment and misunderstandings of what offshoring, quote unquote offshoring to Mexico might lead to. Can either of you speak to that? David, you're up in Canada. I'm wondering what your experience too might be with Canadian companies and US companies relative to that. What may be working in Mexico's favor is kind of the anti-China drive right now, and people moving some manufacturing out of China. So I wonder if each of you could kind of take that topic on, and what opportunities is that creating for you and for companies in North America and beyond?
I think I'll speak first, if that's all right, Eduardo. I think that first of all, your comment about China is right on the money, Doug. Right now, there's a strong pushback, not just in Canada and the United States, but also in Europe and elsewhere, Australia particularly, and Japan to some degree, pushing back against China's dominance in manufacturing, and of course with valid reason. I mean, Eduardo referred to some of the subsidies that are involved. Obviously, that's not fair trade. So there's going to be some pressure there, and I think a lot of people see it in that light. Obviously, if you're moving manufacturing from a location in the United States or from a location in Canada, then people are much more concerned about it, because they see the direct job loss as possibly being an issue. But I think in general, people have come to view, in my experience, that people have come to view the North American market as much more of a single market. I mean, that's been, I think, for many years the case between Canada and the United States, where it doesn't often come up. There's a concern about which side of the border things are happening on. I think that's starting to happen with Mexico, and certainly people see that as favorable to having at least the level we have right now. I mean, I don't think anybody would say we shouldn't be trading with China, but certainly the situation right now is not perceived as being fair. And consequently, Mexico, moving something from China to Mexico, they might prefer that it was moving to their hometown in wherever, New York State or wherever. But I think most people would see that as desirable at this point in time.
Got it. What about you, Eduardo?
I think right now the U.S. is competing with other countries around the world, so I think they should see the U.S., Mexico, and Canada as a bloc to compete with other regions. I think going to Mexico is sometimes a decision to survive and to keep yourself competitive. with what's happening in the rest of the world. So I don't see. I suggest companies not to see Mexico as a competitor, as more as a partner, and a globalized competitive arena. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I try to do. And also, my experience has been that almost 80% of the companies who are looking to nearshore their operations, they're already doing it in China. So it's much better to do it in Mexico. I think there's a lot of economic sense to do it in Mexico. At the end, that will leave more money into the U.S. economy than actually going to manufacturing outside North America.
Got it.
Yeah, I think the key point there, just a quick comment. I've read statistics that say that for every dollar that's spent in China, 10 cents comes back to the United States. For every dollar spent in Mexico, 70 cents comes back to the United States.
Right.
So we'd all benefit greatly if more business came from China to Mexico.
Sure. And we were speaking with Felipe Garcia, Visit Tucson. So Ricardo, in Tucson, the local economy relies on Mexicans coming into Tucson and coming into the US, to drive purchases of a variety of products. Again, it's another thing that you kind of know when you're in Arizona, the interconnectedness of things. And another reason why we love the 258 border monuments rather than the whatever that is, that emotional sense of what a wall is between people that are connected. I want to kind of build on that question. Mike's other part of his question relates to the value of the closeness, and there's two examples I want to cite, and we only have a few minutes, so if you could just each briefly comment on this. Mike's alludes to the fact that you can have manufacturing in Mexico and then have senior management or even fabrication facilities on the US side. And I've seen that myself, and I'm wondering if you've seen that as well, where you can set up a US entity closer to the border and use that to operate or to coordinate. The other part of that is of one thing I've seen over time is companies that have fast product turns. So in the consumer products where you have a lot of new product development and you need that connectivity to the plant, that's a real driving force for companies to have manufacturing closer by versus in China. And I'm wondering if either of you would comment on that as well.
I think both of those points are certainly important. In my experience, probably more companies that we work with do exactly what you said. They don't close their US operation, they don't close their Canadian operation, they don't close maybe even their European operations. It's more of an integrated approach. Certainly the automotive industry, that's the way they operate. So I think, yes, and in fact, I would recommend that in most cases. I think Mexico is a better thought of as just one of the places you put a plant. And integrate it into your overall operation. I think that's far more successful in the long run. And I think that the second point you made is also very, very applicable to the companies that we've seen and the way that they approach Mexico and approach the strategies for North American business.
And I agree. I mean, we have seen it with the two examples I mentioned, St. Clair and Walmart. We have seen how they have grown in Mexico and grown in the U.S. So it's not a one-side growth. Is both sides are growing in the same proportion. So, yeah, I agree with David.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mike Patterson, for your questions, Frank Beltran and Nelson as well. What I'd like to do now, since we're at the end of the hour, is just to kind of go to each of you for a short recap or anything else that we need to consider. Ricardo, could we start with you? Are there some key takeaways that we should have from this session? And please go ahead and let's summarize and wrap up.
Yeah, definitely. I think from my perspective, the key thing is there's a lot of advantages of doing business in Mexico, but there's a lot of things that could go wrong. So make sure that you do your due diligence and talk and explore multiple options. We speak to hundreds of companies, and a lot of them, contract manufacturing seems like the easiest route to go, perhaps, because that's what they do in China. They're looking for the same solution in Mexico. But, we help them explore multiple paths as well. So I think that's the key. If you're thinking about expanding into Mexico, do your due diligence, talk to people like us, talk to people like Eduardo, and make sure that you ultimately make the best decision for your company for the short term and for the long term future as well.
Thank you, Ricardo. I love the dynamics of the three of you, because to me this is, it talks to the global tribe and how we work together. Certainly work hard to work together in a professional way amongst experts. So Eduardo, we really appreciate all that you bring to the table. Could you wrap up next, please?
Yes, no, thank you, Doug. Pretty honored to be here. Pretty glad to be here. I agree with Ricardo. I mean, due diligence is something you have to do, and also you have to try. If you don't try, you'll never know. So if you really want to know what are the possibilities, you should go out and ask professionals their opinion and do the experiment or ask what are the possibilities of doing things, and then maybe that can open your eyes. Maybe it will be the same, but I think you should look at options, and I think Mexico is a great option for manufacturing companies.
Making more money is a good option, right? So,
Right.
it's like, hey, it's kind of business 101. David,
And there's let me just mention that Mexico is 120 million people. It's a growing middle class, so it's a great market also. So I mean, not only look at Mexico as a manufacturing hub, but also look at it as a market and also as a platform for Latin America. So in making more money, that could be a good option.
And the food is fantastic. So
Hey.
I mentioned Felipe Garcia from Visit Tucson. So he was just on a show called Patty on Amazon Prime. Check out the last show of season 8, which dedicates itself to Sonora, Tucson. And then the first show of season 9 that's just now coming out also is a Sonora, Tucson focused. And you start to, I think, from that conversation about food, which many of us are so passionate about, you start to understand the dynamics and the connectivity between Mexico and the US that those of us here on the border or closer to the border, although I'm in California right now, Northern California, understand at a deeper level. And certainly, David, the companies that you work with that have integrated successfully and done one or more of the different options if you talked about, they get it. They're making money. They understand the cultural alignment. They understand the time zone advantages. They understand the cultural connectivity that exists there. And so if you don't mind, could you wrap up and then we'll finish our conversation today?
Yeah, sure. I forgot to mention the food. I should have mentioned that. Mexico is the best cuisine. I think the only thing I'd like to add is that one of the people you should talk to, or one of the groups of people, are the people who are doing it. And we can help hook you up. Eduardo can help hook you up. Maybe your customers and suppliers can help hook you up. But talk to those folks down there that have done exactly what you're thinking of doing. Most of them are more than happy to share their experience and both the successes and the challenges that they've encountered. And I think if you do, you're going to find that there's definitely opportunity in Mexico. And you're going to be successful.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, we do normally have gender balance almost every one of our Globinars, and so I apologize to our audience for not having that today. Although David did have a photo of a worker who was a woman, and we really appreciate that aspect of it. But apologize to the ladies in the audience for not going a little bit further. That's definitely something that we continue to work on, and it'll be a focus again in 2021. Great way to end the year, in terms of an educational Globinar. I believe we have 1 or 2 more, meetup activities here within the year. And then starting on, I believe, January 6th, we have our first meetup. And then, it's going to be clear sailing. I think there's at least 50 or 60 events already either on the calendar or being pulled together for Global Chamber. Our goal is to educate and connect so that you can grow your business faster and better. And there's no better way than to connect up with people who know what they're doing, that are honest and can share with you the pros and cons, like what we've heard today. So as we sign off today, largely for 2020, which most of us want to leave in our rearview mirror and have a better 2021. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, David. Thank you, Eduardo, for your help and your support and really great information today. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to
Happy New Year.
everyone.